Hi everybody, my name is Lara Mani and I'm a research associate at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. And I'm really pleased to be sharing this talk with you today, which is based on our research that I've been conducting with the Seismic Research Centre at the University of the West Indies with Stacey Edwards, who's the co-PI of the project, who is the Education and Outreach Manager at Seismic, and the rest of the Education Outreach team along with other members of Seismic. So this project is very much about evaluating the crisis communications campaign conducted by Seismic during the eruption between the December 2020 and April 2021 of La in St Vincent and the Grenadines. So St Vincent, and I realise that I'm talking on behalf of Seismic here, so please excuse that. But Seismic conducted a really vast range of communications with the public during the eruptive phase, all the way from the beginning of the effusive to the end of the explosive. But it was a COVID year, so unfortunately this became heavily social media reliant, and it through their channels of Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, they were sharing daily briefings and updates with photos and videos, and these are really well recognized, I hope, yellow daily briefings, and technical information like the growing of the lava dome. But one of their principal communication methods was through radio, and this in particular was the Eyeing Freya radio show, or the Richie and Ralph show as it became known, where twice a day, so during the explosive phase twice a day, during the morning and the evening, the lead scientist, in this case it was Richie, would speak with the PM to inform the public about what was happening at the volcano. Other communication outreach things that they tried were Zoom community meetings with various red and orange zone communities right up towards La Freya at the North of the island, and sharing of the volcanic hazard maps around into schools, shops, places like that, more into the communities. This is only a snapshot of the vast amount of things that they were able to do, so please do check out their social media channels to see some excellent examples of some crisis communications. So we believe that there was a few problems with this campaign, though, because it was a COVID year and it was heavily social media focused. A lot of it was reactive rather than proactive, and it meant that we weren't able to be on the ground and kind of seeing who was able to receive those informations and adapt to make sure you're meeting the community needs. So we think that that led to the spread of a lot of misinformation and disinformation. We saw this quite a few times. You've probably seen this referenced in a few of the other talks at the conference. And Seismic worked really hard to make sure that was dispelled really quickly. It also meant that we were likely missing a large chunks of the red and orange zone communities who were most at risk because of lack of access to internet, or levels or low levels of digital literacy or literacy at all. So we think that there was issues with meeting some of the accessibility needs of all members of the communities, and we wanted to probe this and understand how to improve. So Seismic were also responsible for doing stakeholder communications, and they would share information about what was happening at the volcano with the National Emergency Management Organization, NEMO, and that would kind of filter down through the Emergency Organization Committee that was coordinating the response on the ground. We were also keen to understand how well we were coping with their communications to stakeholders in terms of their information needs, how frequently they needed that information, and whether it was enough to be able to inform their crisis response, and whether there was anything that we could do there to improve upon our response too. So in August 2020, we conducted a field campaign to St Vincent. We ran a mass online survey, so in August 2020, this was still in the aftermath of the eruption, with many thousands of people still living in emergency shelters. So that meant that a lot of the people that we actually wanted to capture likely didn't have access to the internet. So we also had two guys on the ground, or Snea or Seth, who went and met people, and some members of NEMO too, who went and met people in shelters and spoke to communities on the ground to make sure that they gathered all of the voices that we wanted to have in this survey. We also ran community focus groups with red and orange zone community, Chateau-Belair, Fancy and Georgetown, and one with a green zone community in Kingstown. So this is the group from Fancy that was still evacuated from Fancy at the time. They were still not allowed to return, so we met them in Kingstown, and the group that we actually went up and met in Chateau-Belair. We've also conducted stakeholder interviews with numerous stakeholders from the Red Cross, from various ministries, the health, tourism, to kind of inform us of what happened during the eruption and kind of build pieces together of the story, stories that emerge. So a really early analysis, because we're still working on this, is that basically we think that the penetration of information has been relatively shallow, and many people didn't hear the official responses, the official information. So including in some cases the evacuation orders. We think due to access through social media platforms, radios and things like this, low levels of literacy, of digital literacy, of being able to access those. But also a lot of people were saying that they were out of work in the fields, or they were out fishing and they didn't hear evacuation orders because they were busy. So that kind of more local component to that too. But in the red and orange zone communities, those that were receiving information was principally through either radio or through neighbours and community members going around knocking door to door. Some people said that they heard the evacuation orders, for example, through people in the streets blowing whistles and using bullhorns. But the Eyeing Lassie Freya show was repeatedly mentioned to us and particularly popular, not only as a source of information, but was also, it kind of became a source of comfort for a lot of people, both during the eruptive phase and even long into the aftermath. But each community was different and each community had different needs. For example, in Château-Belair, we heard that the Red Cross were highly mobilised, and they were the ones that were really on the ground, knocking door to door and sharing that information. In contrast to communities like Fancy on the windward side, who had a much more grassroots approach, where community members, but as part of their own disaster organisation committee, would be responsible for other members in the community and make sure that they had the information, and when the evacuation was called, they were evacuated to the muster points. One of the important things I think we learned was the importance of WhatsApp and how this was being used. So not only as a coordination response for Nemo to coordinate what was going on there, but for example, from the shelter managers to the shelter coordinators, from the Red Cross community leaders in each village were communicating through WhatsApp channels. But I think also one of the most important for us is the diaspora, as because particularly this crisis communications campaign was heavily social media reliant, that was reaching a lot of the diaspora, who were then sharing that back to their family members on island, sharing the infographics and the information that were coming from Seismic directly to their relatives on island. So it proved quite an interesting communication flow for us. So what next? So we're still working on this, but we hope to kind of wrap this up in the next few months. But basically, this is really about building a culture of evidence-based community in the wider Caribbean community, using Seismic as an example. It's about building a communication strategy for Seismic for St Vincent, but also to then adapt that for the future crisis communications work in the wider Caribbean. And it's very much about, this has been a knowledge exchange program, very much about building capacity and capabilities for Seismic to conduct their own evaluation and monitoring work going forward and inform their own practices. So yeah, as I say, this is still ongoing, so I'll leave it there, but please do stay tuned to hear more from us, and I'm happy to take any questions.